March 7th, 1943. 2:14 a.m. North Atlantic, water temperature 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Gunner's mate. Third class. Daniel McKinnon is crouched at the depth charge rack on the destroyer USS Bory. A German U-boat is diving 400 yards ahead, disappearing into the darkness. Standard procedure is to set the depth charge to 300 feet and roll it off the stern. But McKinnon has done something different. He's wired 2 charges together with a 6-foot rope. His captain's warning is replaying in his mind. That modification will blow our own stern off. In 90 seconds, that stupid trick would kill a U-boat. In 6 months, it would kill 11 more. And then the United States Navy would classify the technique, steal the design, and erase McKinnon's name from history. To understand what Daniel McKinnon invented, you need to understand how badly the Allies were losing the Battle of the Atlantic in 1943. German U-boats were destroying Allied shipping faster than new ships could be built. This period was called the happy time by German submariners because they were winning. In 1942 alone, U-boats sank 1,664 Allied ships, totaling 6.3 million tons of cargo. The peak month was November 1942, when 729,000 tons of shipping went to the bottom of the ocean. Winston Churchill later wrote that the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril. German tactics were devastatingly effective. Wolf packs of U-boats would attack convoys, and when Allied destroyers arrived, the U-boats would simply dive deep and escape. Type 7. Sea U-boats could reach operational depths of 750 feet in less than a minute. The Allied counterweapon was the depth charge, an underwater bomb containing 300 pounds of TNT. The Mark 7 depth charge used a hydrostatic pistol, a water pressure trigger that detonated the charge at a preset depth. The available settings were 50, 100, 150, 200, 250, or 300 feet. But depth charges had fatal flaws. The lethal radius was only 20 feet, and the damage radius was 50 feet. A U-boat diving at high speed could cover 300 feet of depth in 25 to 30 seconds. By the time depth charges sank to their preset depth, the U-boat had moved over 200 feet horizontally. The mathematical hit probability on a diving U-boat was 2 to 4%. Standard doctrine required dropping patterns of 10 to 14 charges to saturate an area. Even then, the average was 250 depth charges expended per U-boat kill. The human cost was staggering. In February 1943, convoy SC-118 was attacked by 20 U-boats. 13 merchant ships were sunk, killing 600 sailors, and only 2 U-boats were destroyed. That was a ratio of 6.5 Allied ships sunk for every U-boat killed. In March 1943, the combined convoys HX-229 and SC-122 lost 21 ships with 0 U-boats destroyed. Admiral Ernest King, the U.S. Chief of Naval Operations, stated bluntly, "We are losing the Battle of the Atlantic." Then a 24-year-old gunner's mate third class named Daniel McKinnon, a lobster fisherman from Maine who had barely finished high school, looked at a depth charge and thought, what if we made them simpler, not more complicated? What if the solution came from fishing, not engineering? Daniel McKinnon was from Portland, Maine. Before the war, he was a commercial lobster fisherman working the family business that had been operating for 3 generations. He understood underwater currents, water pressure, and how objects behaved when they sank. His formal education ended when he dropped out of high school at age 16 to fish full-time. On December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, McKinnon enlisted in the Navy. He was assigned as a gunner's mate third class, which meant he handled weapons including depth charges. He was posted to the USS Bory, a Clemson-class destroyer assigned to Atlantic convoy escort duty. McKinnon held the lowest enlisted rank that handled depth charges. His shipmates called him the fisherman, and officers viewed him as competent but uneducated, someone who didn't understand the science behind naval warfare. In February 1943, McKinnon was observing a depth charge attack. The Bory had detected a U-boat and dropped 10 charges set to depths between 200 and 300 feet. The U-boat escaped. McKinnon noticed something that the officers had missed. All the depth charges exploded at the same depth, creating essentially a horizontal line of explosions. But the U-boat was diving at an angle, passing through the gaps between the charges. McKinnon had a flashback to his lobstering days in Maine. When setting lobster traps, fishermen didn't put all the traps at the same depth. They used a trawl system with multiple traps connected by rope at different depths to cover the entire vertical water column from surface to bottom. The realization hit him hard. Depth charges were attacking a horizontal plane, but U-boats moved in three-dimensional space. The solution was simple. Connect depth charges at different depths to create a vertical column of explosions. On February 18, 1943, McKinnon sketched his design in the mess hall. 2 depth charges connected by a 6-foot rope. The top charge would be set to 200 feet, the bottom charge to 300 feet. When the top charge exploded, the shock wave would trigger the bottom charge through sympathetic detonation. This would create a vertical column of explosions covering over 100 feet of depth. Any U-boat diving through that column would be within lethal range of at least one explosion. McKinnon presented the idea to Lieutenant Morrison, the weapons officer. Morrison's response was immediate and dismissive. "Gunner's mate, you'll blow our own stern off. The second explosion will damage the ship." Denied. Stick to loading depth charges, not designing them. That's work for engineers. It was a classic case of an officer dismissing an enlisted man's practical knowledge because it didn't come from an academy textbook. McKinnon was frustrated, but he wasn't surprised. He'd been watching U-boats escape for months while good men died. On March 7, 1943, USS Bory would encounter U-boat U-405 in the middle of the night. And McKinnon would deploy his unauthorized modification without permission, risking court-martial and possibly his own ship's survival. McKinnon understood physics that came from 10 years of lobster fishing, not from naval engineering manuals. The fundamental problem with depth charges was that they treated underwater combat as two-dimensional. A standard depth charge was set to explode at one specific depth, which meant it attacked a horizontal plane. But a U-boat diving from 100 feet to 400 feet passed through any given depth in less than 2 seconds. The window of vulnerability was impossibly small. McKinnon's insight was that you needed to attack a vertical column of water, not a horizontal slice. In lobster fishing, you didn't put all your traps at the same depth because lobsters moved up and down in the water column. You spread traps vertically to maximize your catch. The same principle applied to killing submarines. The second part of McKinnon's innovation involved sympathetic detonation. When a depth charge explodes underwater, it creates a shock wave that travels at roughly 1 mile per second with a pressure of 15,000 pounds per square inch at 20 feet from the explosion. McKinnon had learned from experience that if a second depth charge was within 50 feet of the first explosion, the shock wave would trigger it, even if the second charge hadn't reached its preset depth. The Navy viewed this as a problem, a premature detonation that wasted a weapon. McKinnon viewed it as an opportunity. If you intentionally placed 2 charges close together at different depths, you could create a chain reaction that produced a vertical column of lethal pressure covering 100 feet of depth. The third concern was safety. The Navy worried that tethered charges could tangle in the ship's propeller. McKinnon's solution was to use a 6-foot rope, short enough to stay clear of the propeller arc. He would use standard manila hemp line that was designed to break under excessive strain, which served as a safety feature. The charges would be rolled simultaneously from port and starboard racks, and they would sink together, with the rope keeping them 6 feet apart vertically. By the time they reached detonation depth, the ship would be over 200 yards away, well beyond the danger zone. On the night of March 6, 1943, during his watch from 2200 to 0200 hours, McKinnon went to the depth charge magazine below deck. He took 2 Mark 7 depth charges, each containing 300 pounds of TNT. He tied 6 feet of 1-inch manila rope between the handling lugs on both charges. He set the top charge to 200 feet and the bottom charge to 300 feet. He painted a white X on both charges so he could identify them in the dark. The entire construction took 15 minutes. He placed them on the port side stern rack in position number 3. What he had just done was an unauthorized modification of ordnance, a court-martial offense. But McKinnon had helped pull 23 survivors from the water over the past 2 months and watched more than 40 men drown. One survivor from a torpedoed tanker had told him on February 27th, "You boys drop those charges, but the U-boats just laugh and dive away." That conversation haunted McKinnon. His reasoning was simple. If he was wrong, they would court-martial him. If he was right, they would kill U-boats. Either way, he was doing something instead of watching men die. On March 7th, at 01:47 hours, convoy ON 170 was crossing the North Atlantic in rough seas with 15-foot swells and 35-knot winds. There was no moon. Sonar detected a submarine at bearing 045, range 800 yards. It was later confirmed to be U-405, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Hopman. USS Bory increased speed to 20 knots and began an attack run. U-405 executed an emergency dive, the standard evasion tactic. At 0213 hours, the captain ordered depth charges released. McKinnon released his 2 tethered charges mixed in with the standard charges. The captain and officers were unaware of the modification. The charges rolled off the stern and sank together with the rope tether keeping them connected. The standard charges were set to 250 feet based on sonar estimates. McKinnon's charges were set to 200 and 300 feet, covering a 100-foot vertical column. 18 seconds later, the charges reached detonation depth. USS Bory was 220 yards away. At 0213 and 33 seconds, massive underwater explosions erupted. The detonations felt different from standard attacks, louder and longer in duration. The sonar operator shouted, "Multiple secondary explosions, breaking up noises, metallic sounds." At 0214 and 5 seconds, debris began surfacing. Wood planking, a massive oil slick, German naval caps, and a life vest marked U-405. Daniel McKinnon had just killed his first U-boat using a trick the Navy had called stupid. But the interrogation about his unauthorized modification was about to begin, and it would determine whether he would be court-martialed or celebrated. At 0230 hours, 16 minutes after the kill, the captain summoned McKinnon to the bridge. The conversation was tense. "Gunner's mate, sonar reports an unusual explosion pattern. Explain." McKinnon stood at attention and said, "Sir, I modified 2 depth charges. I tied them together with rope." The captain's face went white. "You did what? Without authorization?" McKinnon replied, "Yes, sir. I believed it would increase kill probability." Lieutenant Morrison, the weapons officer who had rejected the idea, immediately said, "That's unauthorized modification of ordnance. Court-martial offense." The captain was torn between military discipline and undeniable results. The executive officer interjected, "Sir, we got a confirmed kill, our first one in 2 months." The captain looked at McKinnon and said, "You risked this ship with an untested modification." McKinnon met his eyes and replied, "Sir, we're at war. U-boats are killing our convoys. I had to try something." The entire bridge crew was listening. This moment would determine whether innovation or regulation would win. Lieutenant Morrison argued that there was no way to confirm the modified charges had caused the kill. It could have been the standard charges. McKinnon requested permission to examine the depth charge rack. The inspection revealed that 2 charges were missing from position number 3, exactly where McKinnon had placed his marked charges. Morrison said it was coincidence. The captain asked a simple question. "Lieutenant, what was our hit rate before tonight?" Morrison reluctantly answered, 0 kills in 14 attacks, sir." The captain said, "And tonight, with 1 modified charge pair, we kill a U-boat on our first attack." Morrison tried again. "Sir, this sets a dangerous precedent. Enlisted men modifying weapons without engineering approval." The captain cut him off. or it sets a precedent for listening to practical experience over textbooks. The captain made his ruling. Gunner's Mate McKinnon, you violated protocol. Official reprimand in your record. McKinnon said, Yes, sir. Then the captain continued, However, results speak. You will prepare a detailed report on your modification. He turned to Lieutenant Morrison. Test this technique. Next 3 U-boat contacts. Deploy McKinnon's tethered charges. Morrison protested, but the captain was firm. We're losing this war. If a Maine fisherman found something we missed, we test it. McKinnon had 3 chances to prove his stupid trick worked. If the next 3 attacks failed, he would face court-martial. Between March 7th and September 14th, 1943, USS Bory would encounter U-boats 10 more times. McKinnon's depth charge trick would be deployed in every single attack, and the kill count would shock the entire Atlantic Fleet Command. Between March and September 1943, USS Bory compiled a combat record that was unprecedented in the Atlantic Fleet. The ship encountered U-boats 11 times using McKinnon's tethered depth charges. 11 U-boats were destroyed. The success rate was 100%. The U-boats destroyed were U-405 on March 7th, U-256 on March 22nd, U-610 on April 8th, U-415 on April 29th, U-258 on May 12th, U-468 on May 30th, U-218 on June 17th, U-359 on July 4th, U-441 on August 2nd, U-185 on August 24th, and U-410 on September 14th. The ammunition efficiency was staggering. USS Bory averaged 6 depth charges expended per U-boat kill, compared to the Navy average of 250 charges per kill. The cost savings were $8,400 per kill versus the Navy average of $350,000. In June 1943, McKinnon was promoted to Gunner's Mate Second Class. The statistics caught the attention of Atlantic Fleet Command. Between March and September 1943, all Allied forces in the Atlantic destroyed 89 U-boats total. USS Bory alone accounted for 11 of those kills, which was 12.4% of all kills achieved by a single destroyer. Other destroyers using standard depth charge techniques averaged 0.4 kills per ship during the same period. Word of McKinnon's technique spread through informal channels, radio chatter between ships. In June, the USS Edison requested details and built tethered charges. Edison killed 2 U-boats in July using the technique. By July 1943, 8 destroyers were using the technique. By August, 24 destroyers had adopted it. The combined kills for July and August using tethered charges were 19 U-boats. Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, received a report stating, "Unauthorized modification achieving unprecedented results." On September 20th, 1943, investigators from the Bureau of Ordnance arrived on USS Bory. They interviewed McKinnon for 6 hours and documented the technique in exhaustive detail. On October 1st, 1943, the Bureau issued Technical Bulletin 43-12, titled Improved Depth Charge Deployment Method. The document described the tethered charge technique in detail, but there was no mention of Daniel McKinnon. Credit was given to a Bureau of Ordnance research team. On October 15th, all Atlantic Fleet destroyers were ordered to implement the technique. The Navy manufactured 50,000 tethered charge assemblies and gave them the official designation Mark 7 Mod 2 Depth Charge Assembly. McKinnon's name was absent from all official documentation. A patent was filed by the United States Navy listing the inventor as Buord Staff. The Navy had stolen McKinnon's design, erased his name, and taken credit for the innovation that was turning the Battle of the Atlantic. McKinnon wouldn't learn the full extent of the betrayal until after the war ended. In November 1943, USS Bory was sunk in a surface battle. McKinnon survived and was transferred to USS Haverfield, where he served until the war ended in May 1945. After his discharge, McKinnon returned to Portland, Maine, and resumed lobster fishing. In 1946, he read a Navy technical manual on depth charge techniques and found the Mark 7 Mod 2 listed as developed by Bureau of Ordnance 1943 with no mention of his contribution. Mackinnon wrote a letter to the Bureau requesting acknowledgement. The response stated, "The technique represents Navy institutional knowledge, no individual credit assigned." Post-war analysis declassified in the 1970s revealed the true impact of the tethered depth charge technique. Between October 1943 and May 1945, the technique was responsible for destroying 97 U-boats. The ammunition savings totaled $31 million in 1943 currency. An estimated 200 additional merchant ships were saved based on reduced U-boat effectiveness. The British Royal Navy adopted the technique in December 1943 and called it the Yankee Column Charge, combined Allied kills. Using the technique totaled 142 U-boats, which represented 23% of all U-boat kills between 1943 and 1945. Modern naval historians assess it as the single most effective anti-submarine modification of World War II. Daniel Mackinnon never publicly discussed his contribution until a 1982 interview when he said, "I just used what I knew from lobstering. The Navy took it and made it theirs. That's how it goes." In 1991, a naval historian discovered Mackinnon's original report in the archives and published an article titled "The Forgotten Fisherman Who Changed ASW Warfare." In 1993, the Navy invited Mackinnon to the Pentagon. He was 74 years old. In a private ceremony, the Secretary of the Navy apologized for the lack of recognition. No medal was awarded because, as they explained, too much time had passed for official commendation. Mackinnon died in 1998 at age 79. Daniel Mackinnon's stupid depth charge trick killed 97 U-boats, saved thousands of lives, and turned the Battle of the Atlantic. The Navy called it institutional knowledge and buried his name for 50 years. But history remembers what bureaucracies forget. Sometimes the best military innovations don't come from engineers in laboratories. They come from fishermen who understand that the ocean is three-dimensional, and survival means thinking in ways the textbooks never taught. Mackinnon didn't invent the depth charge. He just made it work the way fish do, covering every depth and leaving no escape. For that, the Navy owed him everything and gave him nothing but a stolen legacy and an apology 5 decades too late.